Easy, normal, hard. These are all words we use to define a game's difficulty. But difficulty is a relative thing. What is hard to one person is easy to another, and when games have leveling processes, this can get even more muddled. So how can we tailor difficulty for our players' needs, and give them enough control to get the experience they want? Let's talk about it today on Draw 5 Move 5. Hey everyone, and welcome to the table. My name is Gabe, and this is Draw 5 Move 5, a show where we draw connections between the mechanics behind our favorite games. The recent remaster of Link's Awakening is a beautiful and heartfelt update to a much beloved entry in the Legend of Zelda franchise. It also happens to be the third game in recent years to feature Hero Mode from the start of the game. While its exact meaning has changed between games, the general idea is that enemies hit harder and hearts don't drop from defeated enemies, meaning to heal up you'll need potions or fairies. The idea of difficulty selection, introduced from the start, is what we're talking about today. In our previous discussion, we defined difficulty and broke it down into three core elements: complexity, skill, and danger. If you haven't checked it out, there's a card in the upper right corner, give it a watch. Now that we know what makes something difficult, however, the application of those principles to our own designs requires us to think of our target audience in order to get the difficulty right and get our relative difficulty down. Last week when we talked about Hollow Knight, I described the game as difficult. The game's platforming areas can be challenging and even unforgiving at times, as can the boss fights, both due to their complex patterns, skill demand of the player, and danger involved, knowing that it's very easy at times to lose health and get sent back to the nearest bench. For a game that looks like it should be for children at the start, considering its 2D style and initial beautiful and cute character designs, it seems surprisingly difficult for a kid, until we realize the game is rated E10+. The game's target audience, who the game is designed for, is higher than little kids, more so aimed at mid to late teens and adults due to some of the violence and dark themes. As such, Team Cherry, the game's developer, took the liberty to make the game more challenging. Perhaps it was the other way around, the challenge informed the content. In either case, however, the team knew their target audience, and tailored the content to match. They include some options that allowed players to increase or decrease the game's difficulty via exploration, and charms so the players could tailor the adventure to their playstyle. But the base game is still much harder than something many young children could handle without becoming incredibly frustrated and giving up. What we can learn from this is that Hollow Knight takes its target audience into account when determining its relative difficulty. We can define this phenomena as setting a game's challenge based on the intended player base or target audience. In other words, the game should have appropriate difficulty levels for the players we expect to play it. In Hollow Knight's case, we know the game wasn't designed for children, but people who love platformers and challenging gameplay will enjoy it. There are still easy, medium, and hard challenges for the players, but that easy challenge is going to be much harder than it would be in another game. Another example of this is in some of the more recent Pokemon games, especially Sun and Moon. The staff behind the franchise, especially Junichi Masuda, have expressed in the past a desire to make the games more child-friendly and easier, citing the decreased attention spans of children as a primary factor. They want the games to be less difficult so kids can get into them more. Sun and Moon saw the continuation of the Experience All, an item that granted experience to the entire party for every battle if it was turned on, unlike its predecessor, the Experience Share, which would only grant experience to the item's holder. Additionally, Sun and Moon removed hidden machines, special items that taught terrain-clearing moves to Pokemon. In previous generations, a player would need to keep a partner Pokemon in the party who could use moves like Surf, Cut, and Strength to swim across water, chop down small trees, and move large boulders out of the way. While some, like Surf, Waterfall, and Fly, were retained as technical machines in this entry, which, by this point in the series, had lost the single-use property that made them valuable and made players think about using them correctly, or whatever way suits them best, in previous generations, their functional elements were given to the Pokéride feature. Trainers now have an item they can use to call on a rental Pokemon to aid them. The idea was to make the game feel more immersive and tied to the Pokemon experience by relying on the Pokemon's natural abilities rather than teaching them moves to accomplish the tasks. It didn't hurt that this avoids the problem of players needing to keep certain Pokemon in the party at all times and teach certain moves to them in order to continue progressing throughout the game. It reduced complexity in the games, making them easier for an intended audience that the developers felt needed something simpler and more attention-grabbing. As a result of all of these changes, the games are far easier than they have been in previous years, or have a lower relative difficulty, it can leave a more competitive or adept player feeling dissatisfied and wanting more from the game. Video games like Pokemon that feature level up systems can be a challenge to get the difficulty right in. As the player progresses through the game and they or their party improve, the relative difficulty of each area of the game is based on what the developers expect the player's level to be at that time. If the player avoids battles and runs from town to town, the game may become much harder for them as they're behind the expected level, behind the curve, so to speak. Comparatively, if they defeat every enemy that comes their way and make a point to keep training before moving on to each new area, the player may become overleveled and ahead of the curve, meaning the game is easier for them. While some games can get this right, Chrono Trigger, for example, always feels as though its challenge matches the player's abilities unless they avoid everything or participate in excessive grinding for levels. For others, like the Pokemon franchise, this balance can be hard to strike, especially if the franchise is leaning into an easier direction for younger players. In more freeform games with leveling systems, however, such as tabletop RPGs, relative difficulty can be more in tune with the player's needs. In RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons, the Game Master controls how fast the players gain levels while also controlling the challenges thrown the player's way. A less experienced GM might not be able to properly balance the encounter for the player's levels and desires, like a den of goblins, maybe too much for a group of first level adventurers, but far too weak for a group of 10th level players unless the GM has some serious tactics up their sleeve. With enough experience, it can be one of the most balanced ways for players to get what they want while still giving them a challenge. The big point here is customization, something we've discussed ad nauseum on this channel in the past. The Game Master can customize the story, villains, and game elements to suit the player's wants and desires, all the while controlling how strong the players are and when they level up. The audience for a tabletop RPG can be much more flexible than other gaming genres, as the GM can compensate for the player's desires in real time rather than through iterative feedback from playtesting. A high fantasy game for young kids with comical enemies and puzzles that will make them think, but not stump them, is just as feasible as a knockdown, drag-out sci-fi adventure with deadly consequences and political intrigue that makes the players feel in constant danger. Relative difficulty is highly flexible thanks to this free-form nature, and it means that there can always be an effective challenge regardless of the target audience and their skill level. Tabletop RPGs like D&D have an advantage in tailoring their difficulty to their players' needs, since the person running the game is always interacting with them. But for other mediums where the rules are laid out and the players have to run the game themselves, how can we make the difficulty better fit their needs? Remember how we talked about hero mode earlier in the Zelda franchise? This concept is how we can better tailor the games to our players' needs once we've established our relative difficulty. This is the concept of mode selection. Easy, normal, and hard are the categories we use most often, although plenty of games use their own scales. The God of War franchise, for example, uses a scale of mortal, hero, and Spartan, with God mode, the hardest of all, unlocked after completing the game on any difficulty. With the game's relative difficulty determined and the players primed with what to expect, using mode selection allows the player to set the difficulty for their needs. In our first example of the Link's Awakening remake, the player knows the game should be a little tough, but not very if they've played a lot of Zelda games and are an experienced player. Younger kids, or those with less experience, may struggle, so keeping the game on its normal difficulty would be fine for them. However, for veteran players, they may desire the challenge of a hero mode run, believing the game to be too easy for them. In fact, this is the exact reason for the common New Game Plus option in many modern video games. The game supposes that players who failed it once will want a new challenge, and it offers them the ability to start from the beginning, usually with all their gear they've unlocked, but with much stronger enemies the second time around to challenge them. The Batman Arkham series has done this for a while, and Chrono Trigger may have been one of the first to offer this kind of option with its New Game Plus feature back in its original release from 1995. Mode selection, in a more abstract sense, is also available in analog games, not just electronic ones. Many board games and tabletop games offer different rule sets for different versions of play, which can make the game more challenging or easy for the players. One Night Ultimate Werewolf, a game where all players receive a role for a single night as part of a village, and in the morning must determine who has become a werewolf, if anyone, has a variety of expansion packs in different parts of the base set. Depending on the number of players, more or less roles can be introduced, and complicated character roles can be swapped for easier ones to make the game more friendly to new players, such as replacing any character with the Villager, who doesn't have any special rules at all. Or a more complicated role, such as the Tanner, which asks the players to try and get themselves killed rather than the werewolves, can be introduced to add more layers of complexity and challenge. While it's not exactly a mode select in a traditional sense, this creates a sliding scale that the players can use to increase or decrease the game's difficulty. TCG are also capable of introducing difficulty scales. The Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG released Speed Duels a little over half a year ago, a simplified version of the main game for both nostalgic and new players alike. Aside from skill cards, the game's only new feature, it plays more like classic Yu-Gi-Oh! From the 2000s and has fewer zones and cards to simplify the game. This is arguably the easiest way to start teaching a new player the game, provided we ignore the skill cards that aren't in the main trading card game. As designers, our biggest struggle is always to create a game our players will enjoy. Being able to balance fun mechanics and style with a degree of challenge is, well, a challenge, but also the formula to success in crafting a fantastic game. Deciding who the game is for and how, if at all, its rules can be adjusted to make the game easier or harder for the player is all a part of this process, and is key in creating a game that will be effectively fun and challenging. It's a rough road, but if we're going to design the challenge for our players, whoever said it wouldn't be a challenge for us to create it? Thank you so much for watching. You have my humble and eternal gratitude. What did you think of the conversation? How well do you feel your favorite games hit their target audience when it comes to difficulty? And are there any examples you'd like to share of games that do this well or poorly? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so let's keep this discussion rolling down in the comments. If you enjoyed the conversation and you want to hear more from me, subscribe and dingling that notification bell so you never miss an update. I'm putting out new videos every other week on games and gaming mechanics, and dropping a like lets me know you want to see more. My name is Gabe, this is Draw 5 Move 5, and until next time, go have a good game.